All right. Hello, LifeSpark providers. My name is Qiana Torres Flores, and I am so honored to do this training with you on cultural diversity and how we work with it when it comes onto our tables, because it will. So when we used to do this training in the before times in person, I would ask a very important question, and that would be, how many of you have noticed that I am a little brown? And Sandy would be the only person who raised her hand, which I always appreciated. Now, it wasn't a trick question. It was definitely not a gotcha question, but it definitely showed how much reservation we have about talking about social and cultural identifiers. Now, for me as a brown woman, it's actually a pretty big deal for me as I walk through my life. And it's not for all brown people, but it is for me. At the same time, when we notice difference, we make assumptions about it and what it might mean for that person. On the other hand, we also sometimes will meet our folks on the table and see that maybe there's some identities that we have in common with them. We might come from a similar background or have a similar religion or spiritual orientation. And we might make assumptions about how we are the same. And at the same time, we are likely going to be different in that similarity, if that makes sense. I'll give you an example. In grad school, we had to do a ton of different exercises and reflecting on our own social cultural identities. And I was paired up with someone who also had a Catholic background. And I was so excited because I thought we were going to have so much in common, so much to talk about. And it turned out that because she identified as Irish Catholic, she had a very different upbringing, very different ceremonies and rituals than I did as a kiddo who was growing up in a Mexican community in a Catholic church. So even my assumption that we were going to have something in common was incorrect. So one model that we like to use is the addressing model. And it's one way to be able to conceptualize all these different parts that make up a whole person in a social and cultural context. So for example, in the addressing model is as an acronym. The first one is age. So how old is someone? How young? How old? And with disability, we're thinking about developmental or acquired, meaning did they grow up with it? Is it organic? Or was it acquired down the line, like having to have a limb amputated? With religion, who do they pray to, if they pray at all? Ethnicity and race. And this is different from nationality, which is also one that we'll touch on. But how do they identify with what culture? What does that mean to them? And then sexual orientation, who do they love? How do they want to define that? And socioeconomic status, which is based upon how much money we have or how much money we had when we were growing up. Indigenous populations, so, do they have a lineage going back to people who have been here before conquest? National origin or language, so, what nation are they from? What was their first language? What was their fifth language? And how does that impact them now? And then lastly, gender identity. So, on a spectrum of gender, to include being male or female or even non-binary, where might they land there on that spectrum? And then we're adding a P here for politics, especially in this day and age as divisions go wider and wider. We want to be cognizant of the fact that people have certain political views, be they right, left, or center, and that might make an impact on how we see the world. So here, I want to remind you that any of these social and cultural identities could be pretty visible or invisible. So for example, for me, folks take one look at me and they think that I am a teenager because of how I've aged, but really I'm in my mid 30s. And that's an assumption people are making just by looking at me. But invisibly, I'm actually much older than how I look. And then for an invisible identity that I carry, actually identify as pretty spiritual. However, people think I'm pretty religious because I have some religious tattoos that I sport, but I actually identify as more spiritual than religious. So these are just some examples of how identities can be portrayed visibly or invisibly. So here, what I would like you to do is to hit the pause button and reflect on, what cultural identities might be difficult for you to face in the healing room. And in the next segment, we'll talk about how to manage that. Take a pause. Okay, now that you've taken a little bit of time to reflect on what social cultural identities might be difficult for you to sit across from, I want to talk about implicit bias and how we all do it, even me. I've been doing training in diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice for a very long time, and I still catch myself making judgments of people by what I see or what I'm assuming. So I want to just normalize the fact that we do kind of walk around scoping people out. And I'll tell you that part of it's kind of primal in that we're constantly looking around and assessing for safety. And unfortunately, our culture has decided that certain people who look, talk in a certain way are safe and some are not. With that, we develop these implicit bias when we see or hear someone, we have a whole story that we've made up about them. And I can just guarantee you, when you see a client for the first time, you will likely have a whole story. And for us, we get a little bit of an insight into who they are with paperwork. But once we lay eyes on them, we're developing a whole other story, which may or may not be true. A lot of the times it's our assumptions and it's not all the way true. Now, how do we manage this, right? This is going to happen. And I want to help you with figuring that out with a story. So one person that I look up to in diversity, equity, and inclusion is Vera Myers, and she's an inclusion specialist, attorney, fantastic human being. And she tells the story about how even she, with all these years of education and training other people on these issues, she got on a plane and was settling in and then heard the voice of the pilot and heard that it was a woman's voice. And the instant she decided that it was a woman's voice, she was concerned about whether or not they were going to make it to their destination, whether or not this was going to be a smooth trip. And then immediately, with all her training, she was able to stop herself and say, oh, wow, I just made this assumption based on what I'm assuming is this person's sex, gender, that this is going to be a bad trip. There's her bias. She noticed it pop up right away. And then she was able to sort of reel herself back and think, would I make this same kind of assumption if I heard a male voice? And she said, no, I wouldn't. I would just sit right back into my chair and enjoy my trip. I wouldn't have these same kind of concerns. So in doing some of that fact checking for herself and acknowledging that she had made a mistake, she was able to reel herself back in and be able to give the same kind of care and acknowledgement to this pilot that she was likely going to have a smooth flight. And she ended up having a smooth flight, noticing those assumptions that she was making, working herself up. So in this example, Vera was able to admit she didn't know. She didn't know everything about this pilot. And she needed to assume that there's going to be some differences, similarities between her and this pilot. She noticed that she was being judgmental, and then was able to collect some information internally with herself to evaluate, oh yeah, I'm probably going to have an okay time, because I wouldn't assume this of anyone else. She had some empathy for the pilot in that she probably knew that this pilot worked just as hard as anyone else to have this job. Was able to see that she was making assumptions in the moment, that just because the pilot might have been female, that she was gonna not do a great job. She noticed she made that assumption. And then probably the most important part is that she was able to hold some ambiguity in that she acknowledged she made her mistake and was able to say, okay, and I can do better. I can see this person fully and not just through the lens of my assumptions. And lastly, the way you want to manage cultural diversity is to be able to just embrace that it exists, that the person sitting across from you is going to have differences and similarities, and they're not something to run away from. They're something to run toward and to use as strengths in your client's life. As a provider myself, leveraging these cultural identities has been very helpful in that a lot of the times folks are really resilient, and it may or may not come from some work that they did on themselves. It might actually come from one of these social and cultural identities. For example, if someone has a really strong faith in Christianity, that might be something that helps them really root down into their healing journey and supports them in the work that you do together. So with all that being said, thank you so much for hearing me out on this very important topic of social and cultural identity. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Sandy. Thanks so much.